I'll start. So hi, welcome. We actually prepared this EndNote talk with our colleague Jane, who is unable to be here today. And it is actually inspired by a structure that I have pursued with Jane in the past, and I actually feel like it is Jane's structure, where instead of coming together with like a bunch of things we want to say, we come together with a bunch of questions that we want to ask. So we got together, had a meeting, came up with this a set of questions, and Mitchell and I are going to reflect on those questions over the course of an hour. And we were also hoping, inspired by Vivienne and Alex this morning, that we could encourage conversation with you as the talk goes on, just because it is late in the day and it's harder to stay focused. And so the first slide is like sort of more about who we are, but the next slides after that will like pause. And so invite you to also reflect on any of the questions that speak to you. Do you want to say anything?
I think that sounds great, Naomi.
I truly am bossy. Okay, you can advance the slide. So this question too is really a Jane question, wanting to always invite people to come to the table with an expression of like how you got here. And so that's the spirit of the first question. Mitch, how do you come to this work?
Well, maybe before we do this, are we going to do the introductions?
Oh, shoot. Yes.
Okay.
Well, this is a perfect segue, actually.
Oh.
So we also wanted to introduce each other like Alex and Vivienne did this morning. Mm-hmm. So I have known Mitch since 2015, when I was just starting as a tenure track professor at McGill University, and Mitch was in my class on the philosophical foundations or theoretical foundations of education. It was a theory class. And we have been working together ever since, really. Back then, I was a mom of 2 little kids, doing the daily grind, trying to make it on the tenure track. Fast forward 10 years later, Mitch is a dad of a little kid around the same age, on the daily grind, trying to make it on the tenure track. He is now an assistant professor at Concordia University, which is, I think, important to hear, because sometimes the narrative for people in grad school is that there's no hope for a future of secure employment, and there is.
I think he's corroborating this.
Yeah. Mitchell's work is on climate justice and education and community gardening and its relationship to gentrification and housing justice. He also is a gardener himself, a biker, a canoeer, a boater, and he really likes the Habs.
I do. Thank you very much, Naomi. That's a very accurate description of who I am. Now, I'm sure most of you know Naomi really, really well. And like Naomi mentioned, we met in 2015, and it was a really serendipitous moment in many ways. Naomi wasn't even supposed to be teaching the class that I enrolled in. And I wasn't even planning on staying in that class. And I met Naomi, and it changed my life. It sent me down a much different research trajectory, and one that I'm incredibly grateful for, because it forced me to see things in different ways. And I felt like I came to that class with a really good understanding of what conventional qualitative research was all about. And working with Naomi, it was one of the most transformational experiences of my life. And thinking about this moment and semester and then the years that followed, now that I am in a position as an assistant professor, I couldn't be more grateful for the work that we've done together, and it's a real privilege to be here sharing this stage with you. And a big shout out to our friend and colleague, Jane Malenfant. Maybe in some of the responses today, I'm gonna do my best to honor the relationships that we've developed together, and some of the amazing and seminal contributions that Jane and Naomi have made to my life and scholarship.
So the first question that I feel like now we've told you how we come into the work in parts. Like we come into the work in relationship with one another. I was working in housing and homelessness research. Mitch started also working in housing and homelessness research as it intersects with gardening and gentrification and greening processes in cities. One of the themes of this event right now is legacy and like honoring the legacy of the ideas that come before you, and relationship in research and in activist scholarship in particular. And we won't go on and gush forever, but one of the most formative relationships I have found that you have as you're going through sort of like leaving your own graduate work and entering into a more permanent position is this relationship you have with your students and the people that you work with in solidarity towards particular aims, like towards housing justice or whatever you're working toward. Do you want to say anything more about how you come to it, or that first one?
Yeah, I just, like Naomi mentioned, a lot of my work explores the extent to which education, environmental education, adult education can actually and meaningfully achieve aims of social, environmental, and climate justice. And more, we're learning that climate justice is connected to housing justice. And the climate crisis is so deeply intertwined with housing justice, and it disproportionately impacts people experiencing homelessness, while also impacting low and moderate income people and tenants. So as these extreme weather events like heat waves and severe storms intensify, unhoused people and tenants in poorly maintained housing face super dangerous conditions. So I think it's important to understand that there are these connections. Yeah, so that's like how I come to this work as a scholar who works a lot with climate justice.
And do you feel also like telling us what the concept of housing justice means to you?
Yeah, sure. So at a conceptual level and a practical level too, it's about equitable access to safe, affordable, and adequate housing, right? Regardless of income, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, or other characteristics. And it's rooted in the belief, and I think this is important, that housing is a fundamental human right.
For me, I came at it slightly differently and maybe more simply just about fairness. And not so thinking about housing not just in terms of individual property ownership, financial capital, or even housing as a human right, even though that's something that I believe matters, but just thinking, or a reminder to keep thinking about how the benefits attached to housing are distributed, who has too much housing or who benefits the most from the financialization of housing. Paying attention to that matters just as much as who has too little housing or who is being harmed most by the financialization of housing. And that sort of orientation to fairness is at the root of what attracts me to that concept. And again, I think probably my glomming on to that idea came from Jane, who runs at McGill like a housing justice friends collective. And it's a way of bringing together people who are differently impacted by the current affordability crisis to work together towards housing justice. So even though you may not be directly experiencing homelessness, and maybe you're actually benefiting from the financialization of housing, you have a seat at the table in the pursuit of housing justice. And that's something that I really think matters. What do you see as like implicating, on that note, like where I just sort of left off, how are you implicated in struggles for housing justice? You and I both have houses.
We do. So I think it's important for me to differentiate how I am currently implicated in struggles for justice, because in many ways I feel like I'm far less anchored in community-based organizations than I was several years ago. And I think this feeling is partly due to the pressures that I felt in relation to like pre-tenure life and the type of productivity. So it's fair to say that I'm kind of writing and teaching more about community-based research, housing justice, social and environmental movements, and less about the actual doings of it right now. But strangely, my work hasn't changed, because many of the research projects that began a decade ago and emerged from my PhD work, with Naomi, with Jane, are ongoing, because honestly, not much has changed, and in many ways, it's gotten worse.
Yeah, I took this question in a slightly different direction. So this is the fun of like we come up with these questions and we see what happens. But I was thinking about my family and sort of the way that I was implicated in this history of housing relations. My grandparents grew up on the prairies. They were immigrants during the Depression. My grandpa had flat feet and asthma, so he couldn't go to war. And so he rode the rails to Ontario as a young person in pursuit of like viable work. He needed to make money. And from that was able to actually build a whole life of entrepreneurial, like my grandma and my grandpa ran a country store and a summer resort, and they were even landlords for a while. And when they were when they were my grandparents, when I was alive, they had a cottage and a house. And so I was thinking about this like possibility of going from homeless when you're 14 and riding a train from Saskatchewan to Ontario and ending up later in life with way more housing resources than a person could need. And this is like the legacy of Canada that I inherited and that I really benefited from, and how quickly things have changed. So even I'm like Generation X. My cousins would also be in that generation. They left home as young people on their own and were homeless as young people, but were able to mobilize from that to become quite financially stable, one of them later on in life, and the other one less so. That was like part of the impetus for the research that I did as a doctoral student. And I think now a difference is that that's not possible in the same way to mobilize, especially if you're young, from an experience of extraordinary instability towards a future where you are housed and you see like a way to support yourself and your family. And that has nothing to do with any of us working harder or less hard. It's just that the conditions backgrounding our lives, the political economic situation has changed so profoundly in that period of time that all of a sudden now it's so much harder to realize housing justice as a young person in our country than it was even 20 years ago.
And if I may, I have a house now, but 4 years ago I was rent evicted from an apartment that I had for 8 years. And as a group of tenants, we got together almost every night in the backyard as a team. We mobilized, we connected with different housing rights associations, advocates, et cetera. And eventually, one person decided that they actually wanted to take the payout that the landlords were offering. And once that person took the payout, the work began. So like sometimes when I'm relating to housing justice now, a lot of it is like sharing what happened, how it happened, and then also like explaining to other people or tenants about what landlords are doing to ensure that but rent prices continue to spike in really high ways. And so I'll give you a really interesting example. What landlords can do is they could backdate the form of the new rent 15 days, and it basically forces someone or prevent someone from going to the régie, which is the organization that would hold people accountable, hold landlords accountable, and would basically force a tenant to accept that rent. And if that tenant doesn't accept that rent increase, well then there's someone else in line. And that's what gentrification does in many ways, is a ladder, right? As real estate increases, as investment in land increases, as land is continuously treated as a commodity that could be worth one thing one day and significantly more the next, it has an impact on everybody.
Well, and I think it's also the opportunity in thinking about housing justice as connecting you and I and you and I and you and I, is that you learn something from your experience of being a rent evicted that can help Alex prevent that from happening, or like that not tactical knowledge, sharing it and finding ways to again work across difference so that we are together sort of pushing back against some of those forces of financialization. You can advance the slide. So this is like also the theme of the conference, doing research that matters. And so we wanted to really reflect on what it means to do research that matters. And this is also an opportunity for us to engage a little bit with you all about what it means to do research that matters. And we invited ourselves to come at this question from a place of experience. Like what has it meant to you in your life to do research that matters?
Okay. Yeah, this is a hard question for me to answer, and I'll just explain why. A lot of literature on environmental education or climate change education or community gardening, in my opinion, is really over-celebratory in its discourse. And so I take a pretty critical perspective. And when I take that critical perspective, it's hard to kind of position myself to think about how some of the work that we've done as a group of friends and activists has had a material difference on people's lives. But it's important. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the projects that I've been engaged in over the last little while. We've set up like summer internship programs for young adults. Some were university students, some were young adults who were experiencing homelessness or barriers to education and employment and food insecurity. And we set up a garden team, and people took on different tasks. And they were provided with, full-time employment for 8 to 12 weeks. Some of them wanted to garden, some of them wanted to do art, some of them wanted to create music. It was really cool in a lot of ways. But it also, it shaped the work because we were accountable to funders in different ways. So with the intention of wanting to be everyone's mentor and friend, when I was being asked to submit forms on people's demographic information or monitor people's work progress, I kind of turned into a boss rather than a mentor, and that undercut some of the social and environmental intentions of the work. But thinking about why we continued to do this project over the years, some of the benefits of the project, of the research, included offering relevant paid employment for young people who were experiencing barriers to employment, food insecurity, and homelessness, providing mentorship and opportunities for underserved young adults or students to express themselves through art, photography, music, film, or gardening, right? Like there's this idea that the soil is a canvas. Facilitating partnerships between schools and organizations with mandates of social and environmental justice for mutual benefits. Sometimes, I think about how busy teachers are and the increasing tasks that teachers are asked to all of a sudden add to their already busy work lives. Sometimes just letting teachers know that there's an environmental education coordinator at their school board makes a material difference. But for a long time, many teachers with whom I partnered were coming to me for support, and I would be hooking them up with someone at the school board who could do exactly what I could do, and it's their job to do so. They just didn't have time to actually connect with one another. And then acquiring prolonged financial, learning, and human resource support to educators, learners, and community workers and community members while developing ethical relationships and collaborating to accomplish shared objectives.
Awesome.
It's not bad.
I was thinking about this question and thinking about this damn article that we all read for today's class that I've been reading, I think, every year since today's school.
Yeah.
Since I was a graduate student, and I wanted to be the political activist as ethnographer. And I have wanted to do research that makes a difference since I started, but in this way that was a bit naive, maybe. I also, I wasn't part of a social movement. I now look back and think, what kind of hubris did I have where I was like, I, lone doctoral student, will change the face of youth homelessness. And so I've been kind of grappling with what it means to do research that makes a difference and whether research can actually make a difference. Does it really matter in social change efforts, especially separate from movement organizing? And I don't know that it does, separate from movement organizing. And so remembering that you are part of something bigger and trying to tap into that in a humble and curious way is maybe the stance to adopt. One thing I really struggle with often is how thorough and rigorous does the research need to be useful? And often the things that I think really matter around a really long methodology section don't matter to the people that I'm trying to produce some knowledge for and in service of shared aims. And so that has been a little something that I've struggled with. One of the things that we have found recently that works really well are these tiny little booklets or zines that we make, and we just take one small common sense misunderstanding and try to reveal it reveal what's actually going on from a sort of how it's put together point of view. So something like, how come nobody's in the shelters? Why are they all sleeping outside? And trying to make the social organization of emergency shelter provision accessible and knowable to people who are legitimately confused about what's happening in our community, and to make it clear why the criminalization through evicting those encampments is problematic in relation to how that intersects with the criminal legal system, and why that's really like not the way to go. And so it's not these really long treaties actually, but these tiny little booklets that we put in the library that seem to be most helpful for trying to participate in efforts to shift how the public is responding to a social problem like homelessness. Materially, I also think some of the stuff Mitch talked about, like just using research as a way to redistribute economic goods, has been something that I've tried to do. I think that as researchers, we're not good at a lot of things, but we are really good at grant writing often. And so to figure out like how to get money, as a graduate student, Mitch actually was getting money for community partner organizations that I used to work with in Montreal, or Toronto.
And Montreal.
Yeah, and Montreal. So trying to use our skills to actually contribute in the ways that matter, which often don't matter for our careers, but having that balance in the work where you are actually deploying your resources in a way that makes the biggest difference. The other thing, again, both Mitch and I have done is like work opportunities to people who are not provided with work opportunities, often in places like this. So I write letters sometimes as part of people's probation agreements. I'm often writing letters when people are looking for housing to help substantiate their relationship to this institution, which is seen as powerful. So if you hire people who've been excluded from labor markets, who've been excluded from housing markets, and sort of use that as an opportunity, you do research, but part of it is like to actually help people leverage some of these resources to enable needs meeting that matter to them outside of this place, and to see if we can rebalance some of the power right now that, for example, that landlords hold, where they get to choose everybody and they're always going to choose, what do they say, like professionals or students. And so if you can give the letter that says this person is a professional at Trent University, this is their job, it can actually be helpful just materially in like redistributing some of those opportunities. And so this sort of brings me to my final point on this question, although I have so many more notes.
Keep going, this is great.
That one of the other things, and this directly relates to the article that we read, is that research can be really useful in helping explain why common sense understandings of a problem are wrong. And I think that has been something that's been particularly important about the tools of institutional ethnography, and that way of putting together a body of evidence that counters what we've been told to believe. And I'm thinking about a project in particular that Sam and I worked on together, where we were trying to make sense of a bunch of things that were happening in relation to homelessness in our community, and why the federally mandated tools that we were required to use weren't working to solve homelessness in the ways that we were told that they would work. And so the piece that was really important is showing that the problem that these tools were meant to solve was not the problem. So the tools were offered as data-driven mechanisms for solving homelessness, with the suggestion that the problem was that service providers didn't know how to match people effectively to resources. But that diagnosis of the problem ignored the fact that we had no housing resources to connect people to. And so trying to systematically put together that analysis with people who had lived experience of homelessness, working to create and carry out the study, and then also talking to service providers, sort of mapping the policy ecosystem that was surrounding all of this stuff in order to demonstrate that it wasn't us, that was the problem. It wasn't that our community had poor quality data, which was the explanation we were given by the consultants that were selling the programs that we had to use. The problem was that we had poor quality housing. We didn't have enough housing that was affordable for the numbers of people who needed it. And it seems like such an obvious conclusion to come to, but we were really pushing upstream in order to make this claim. And then in doing so, working with local activists who had actually inspired the study in the first place to do something with those findings. And that work is ongoing today. Like we can't stop. Like it's not like we finished the study and then all of a sudden everything was better. Like we finished the study, we created some changes in our community that were really progressive and good, and homelessness got worse. Yeah. And so it's like also this piece around like continuing to stay in the work and not being like, as a researcher, well, I've done my part, like I delivered my final report. We stay on in the advocacy, like Colin and Sam and I are all in an advocacy coalition with folks at a local organization called One City, and we're constantly thinking about new ways to organize in order to advance housing justice and other forms of intersecting justice where research maybe doesn't matter at all sometimes.
Do we want to throw this question out to the audience?
Any thoughts on what it means to do research that matters from your own experiences?
I can tap on just a little bit to what we're talking about, that the project that Naomi and I were a part of. One of the things that, for that project, that really helped me feel like what we were doing was going to make a difference proactively even, was that we started with outputs before we were done. Right, so we started, like we collected data and then we created the zines so that people could actually start making use of the knowledge that we were generating before we were completely done the study, because that's usually how it's portrayed. Then by the time you create these outputs, it's 2 years later and like they need to be redone because the context has changed so much, right? So I think that, and I still go back to that a lot when I'm thinking about things, is that piece of like making the research work for you in the time that you're doing it, to try to mobilize it to create some change versus waiting for everything to come at the end and then do the traditional way. That's something for a long time with that project.
Yeah, and it's where we sort of did also have to confront that balance between like ultimate perfect research rigor and like just providing something that was useful in this case to help people understand like what even is this new rationalized model for resource distribution everyone has to use. How can we explain it to someone so that they could use this guidebook we created to figure out how to move through the system more effectively? Anybody else? What does it mean to do research that makes a difference?
I'm going to lean back into the psychosocial because that's my jack. Like for going, I think very often it's a type of visceral justice. When you go, you see an injustice out there in the world. You know you can't change the world, but you can change a part of it. And not to use an already overused phrase, but it's making lemonade out of your very own lemons, being able to share that with another. I'm really stretching metaphor, sorry. But it makes a difference to say, okay, I changed something. I made a bit of a difference. I made it easier, so now that I know, if I'm in that situation, I know somebody I can talk to. If I'm not sure about what I can go and find out, I can find the confidence that I need to keep going. So I think it's all in there somewhere. But I think research that makes a difference, what does it mean to do research that makes a difference? It means you make a difference. And that's important. That's meaning. That gives meaning to what we're doing, right? Which is all very chat. Thank you.
I am not commenting as a researcher, but in the organization where I work, we have this community education program that Naomi mentioned earlier in the day. And I just wanted to mention that we had a tech prof approach us and ask if her research could be of use to us. Mm-hmm. And she developed a 2-hour training, because we offer some shorter trainings in the evening that are meant to reach our neighbors, our supporters, but also those who disagree with us. to try to give them that body of evidence that counters a common understanding. This one was around autonomy. And so the idea that homelessness is a choice is an understanding that a lot of people hold. And so she, Nicole Feist is her name, brought her body of work to us in a really accessible way and created a resource for us that we could post online and share. And so what does it feel like? It feels like someone cared about the work we were doing and saw how their research could maybe make a difference in a new place, a new audience. And that felt great.
And she was a philosopher, that professor, too. So I think it's amazing. Anybody else? Okay. So Mitch, to whom are you accountable in your research?
Yeah, I feel really accountable to teachers, and I feel really accountable to students. I feel young people, adult students. I feel accountable to my students. I feel accountable to frontline harm reduction workers and community workers, and all community members. And ultimately, this is something that I've been working on a lot, is like feeling accountable to myself, right? Like that's something that I've neglected for a long time. Another relationship that I've been quite negligent with in the past is my relationship to the planet. And I feel accountable to the planet that sustains us, right? We have a dependence on clean air. We have a dependence on clean water. We have a dependence on all the things that we're kind of experiencing right now, our food systems, pollinators, et cetera. So, yeah, and I work with this idea of who I'm most accountable to, and I think about like, who needs what when, and as I mentioned earlier, some of the projects that I've described and shared with you today, they're still ongoing, so I'm still writing grants for people in different organizations, although I'm not located there in the same way that I once was. So, yeah. I feel very accountable to my community partners, to my school partners, and yeah, it's a very hard thing to do, and communication is really challenging these days. I'm finding people are unbelievably busy, overworked, underslept, feeling this like neoliberal crunch where everyone is forced to do a lot more with a lot less, and so, yeah.
I like that. Well, I don't like that we are being forced to do a lot more with a lot less. I feel that. One of the things that happened when I moved here to Peterborough from Montreal, I was in the process of setting up the Research for Social Change Lab, and I had a graduate student say, you have some values guiding your work, and I can tell you have them, but I don't know what they are. And I think it would help us all if you articulated what you thought they were. And so I tried, and then we workshopped them, this like first generation of Research for Social Change Lab people. And so I'm accountable to the values that we came up with as a group, and I will just share them with you briefly. They are pretty simple: community, joy, purpose in research, dexterity, like being flexible in research, research with, not on people, and reciprocity. And so what I really liked, Jenny, about your example is like that it also is conveying some values around that. Like I am not asking if I can interview your clients for my project. I'm asking if I can bring something of use to the work that you're doing because I believe in the goals you're pursuing and think I might have something to add. And so that sort of spirit is how I am also trying to work. And for that reason, I see myself as like accountable to people, and not like in the abstract, but actual people who I know and care about. The people who work at the lab, the students who I supervise and teach, the people who participate in our studies as research subjects. I really feel accountable to them and the things that they share with us. My colleagues, the people who work in organizations with whom I collaborate. And then this is like a particularly weird thing for me, but I'm so accountable to Peterborough, to this weird, shitty town that I grew up in. I feel really implicated in the way it is right now, which is not a fair place to live, and the struggles that people are having. And I really, really care about what's happening here and about trying to make it a better place for people to live, the folks who are particularly struggling to live here right now. The other thing that I was thinking about in writing up an answer to this question was about, like, I do a lot of participatory research projects, and so the people who I have relationships with in the context of that participatory work, and the influence of doing that kind of participatory co-leadership with Jane, who's not here today, when we were at McGill, and the way that transformed what I was aspiring towards in research. And I think, again, really, like, inspired by that article by George Smith, I was always like, policy change, it's the way. That's the way most people will be impacted by the work that we do. And working with the team of young people that Jane and I were working with for about 3 years in Montreal, all young people who'd been homeless and sometimes were homeless again when we were working with them, I became much more convinced that the power was actually in the relationships that we were building. And yes, policy change matters, but I couldn't, often when I had seen that the research I had done had contributed to policy change, in the end, the way the institution functioned still messed everything up for people. And so I felt like I had no control or power over that, but I had power over how I brought myself into relationships with people, and the mutual aid we could bring one another and the care we could bring one another. And it's very small scale, like you're talking like an N of 4 or 5, but it maybe is the only thing that I can say I've made an impact doing in my life, is having good relationships with people on these projects and committing to really learning from one another and learning together, and that idea of like seeing how our experiences are reflexively organized, so that even though I bring different lived experience to the table, it is lived experience that bumps up against and connects me to all of the other people who are also at the table. And so, over the course of my career, that's mattered a lot more to me in terms of like the who I'm accountable to. They're actual people who I love. And Viviane, I was really struck by, you were speaking in a similar way this morning. These are my people. I'm accountable to my friends who are the people I'm in this work with. Does anybody else feel called to respond to that question in any way about who you're accountable to in your work?
Thanks, Vicky. I think it kind of connects a little bit to the last question, but really, when I think about it, I think about being accountable to my grandchildren and my grandchildren's grandchildren. And it's connected. Anyone who knows my research knows that it's connected with that. But when you read my QED, but it's really about that responsibility as a parent, and that came into focus once I became a parent. That didn't exist before, and so that's where I look. It was like a North Star a few generations ahead.
Which connects with what you were saying about climate justice too. Anybody else?
I'm accountable to all the similar things that Naomi is accountable to, and I feel a very strange dedication to hero. But actually, I think the person that I try to be the most accountable for in the work I do now is the person I was when I was working frontline. Because when I was working frontline, I was engaged in these institutions and engaged in this work in a way that I didn't understand the larger institutional repercussions, right? Like it was very much in the moment, helping people figure out how to navigate these systems, get them into housing, get them hooked into services, right? All of these things, which in the moment felt like such a great thing to do for my community. But then the more I did it, and as my roles changed, and the more I learned, the more I realized, oh, shit, I'm actually a sleeper cell for neoliberalism. Like, I'm actually just helping perpetuate neoliberal ideology and helping people learn to just blend into neoliberalism. And so that is something I think about consistently when I'm thinking of my work, is that I'm trying to, in a way, make up for some of the damage and harm that I was actually a part of that I didn't understand that I was a part of at the time. So not in like not like penalizing myself or anything like it, but it's to maintain that awareness, because I'm also hyper aware of the fact that that cannot begin in the position that I'm in now, right? So it's being accountable to like the reason why I'm here.
Well, we're gonna do one more and then advance. Oh, we're gonna do two more.
Not to get us too far off track, I really appreciate what's been said so far about accountability as a moral philosopher. I think it's super, super important. But just in your own words, because I feel like it's one of those words that's starting to lose its meaning a little bit, because we've been saying it a lot. And this is essentially the third question on your slide. But my question is, why is it important to you as both activists and researchers? And what does accountability look like to you? If you could give an example in action, and but my question is, like, what is the value of accountability other than being open and accountable?
It's like at the heart of the social contract is partly it, and I feel like we have lost that sense of accountability. It's not a proverb, that's the wrong word, but there's that expression of like, my liberation is tied up in yours, and that we have to enact that in our daily lives in order for this to work as a society that cares about one another, that fights the pull of individualization that neoliberalism is constantly sort of imposing on us. I'm not sure, I feel like I'm just taking your conversation in a weird way. Practically speaking, I think it sometimes is, remember I said I had those values? When people challenge me, who I work with, especially people who have lived experience of the social problems we're looking at, and say, I think you're at a step with your values, it's like taking that really seriously and trying to come back in step, and admitting that that does happen and that I am wrong sometimes. Thank you.
That's where I was going to go with that too. If you've spent time in activist contexts, community-based organizations, social movements, you're going to get called out for something. You're going to make a mistake. Mistakes are inevitable. So being accountable for your mistakes. Acknowledging harm. Moving forward. Doing better. Working harder. Failing faster. Failing smarter. Failing again, and understanding that it's a process.
Let's advance to the next one. Yeah. This is our last one. So, you've made it. And this was really a question that I feel like was for you, Mitch, because we were just talking about I'm really, what are the, as academics do, what are you thinking about these days? What are the ideas you love? And so I thought it was sort of fun to end on this invitation to talk about the ideas that really have you motivated or inspired or excited, that maybe someone's work who's really inspiring you, and with an orientation to the last bit around what also advice do you have to offer folks starting out?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, it's your question.
Yeah, all right, I appreciate that. Yeah, and so I'm gonna bring this back to 2015. I think it was 2015 or 2016. I was actually introduced to this idea of care because I was working with you, Naomi, and I think you taught an entire philosophy of education course around An Ethic of Care by Nell Nodding. So this is when I first came to this idea, but for whatever reason, it's taken hold of me over the last 6 or 7 months. And so I think there's also some great connections to institutional ethnography around this idea of care. And feminist scholars have significantly contributed to and expanded the concept of care in ethics, moving beyond early formulations to address its complexities and implications. So when I think about Nell Noddings or Carol Gilligan, they really challenged traditional ethical theories that emphasized abstract reasoning, impartiality, and individual autonomy. They argued that these theories neglected the importance of relationships, emotions, and context in moral decision-making, which are central to today's readings, or today's reading, and the kinds of discussions that we have been having all day. Right? And care is relational, and this involves a connection between the one caring and the one being cared for, highlighting the interdependence of human beings. This perspective shifts the focus from the individual to the relationship as the site of moral concern. Moving on from Nell Noddings, I'm really into Maria Puig de Bellacasa, who wrote a book in 2017 called Matters of Care. Yeah, exactly. Humanity is over there, Luca, nice one. Yeah. Right? And everything from our social institutions to the soil that our food grows in, without care, they will inevitably fall into disrepair, and they require maintenance. I also want to talk a little bit about Vanessa Machado de Oliveira Andreotti, who uses the concept of hospicing as a metaphor for a particular kind of care related to systemic change rather than individual care. Andreotti employs hospicing not in the sense of caring for a person who is dying, but as a way of framing how we should approach the decline or collapse of modernity, which she uses as a capsule term for late-stage modern global capitalism or neoliberalism or settler colonialism. And it's about providing care to a system that is unsustainable and causing harm, while also acknowledging that something new needs to emerge.
It's so interesting when you do this, like a message in a bottle. I, again, approach this so differently. I was like thinking about people. Dorothy Smith, Alison Griffith. Alison was my supervisor, and I knew nothing about the social sciences. She was my entry into the social sciences, and that really matters in who I am and who I was then. George Smith was my idol. I never have seen him or heard him. I can't wait to hear his voice tomorrow. But he was who I wanted to be when I grew up as a researcher. And Dorothy was almost like a religious leader. I was pouring through her text, being like, there's a message in here for me. I just need to be able to get at it. And then since then, it's mostly been students who I've worked with, people who work in the lab, who bring me things to read, who say, I would listen to this, you should listen. And just trying to keep up with this stream of awesome content out there is actually overwhelming, but I find it really inspiring. I did try to I tried to also engage more specifically with this question, and I was thinking about something that I'm a little bit obsessed with, and I can hear other people are also obsessed with it, is the relationship between what's happening inside our bodies and the social worlds that we are participating in. And so I think this is coming from years of sort of working around social pediatrics and the social determinants of health, but a project that I'm working on with Marianne right now and a whole bunch of parents in our community about parenting. And what I'm seeing is that it would be really interesting if we could figure out how to connect a science of society to a science of the body, and the way that things like the hypothalamus pituitary axis or HPA axis is actually fundamentally wired to the social relations that we're participating in. And so I see that as connected to the same sort of energy that I'm hearing around people like Matthew saying, I want to talk about the body, and Chris saying there's something about affect and emotions, and we've been trying to play around with how do we do this as institutional ethnographers in a way that doesn't capture us, so that all of a sudden, Marianne was talking in the IE reading group on Friday about all of a sudden I was talking about stressors. And so we don't want to do that, but is there a way in the spirit of IE that we could still really connect to the body, not as a abstraction, the body is in the abstract or embodiment in the abstract, but what is physiologically and neurologically and genetically at stake in our bodies. And so Alex McClellan's research on blood surveillance, I think, is also really interesting in this regard. And so that to me is a piece that I am curious to see what could come from over the next decade of work from people in this room, and maybe also me. And advice for graduate students, I really wish that I hadn't worked so hard. actually, that I'd been more forgiving of myself, and that I hadn't thought that I could be George Smith right out of the gates, and that I had taken a little more time and care with my own self and with my family when I was trying really hard to be almost like a person who didn't have a family, that didn't have those caring relationships when I was outside of the house, and then having to come home and turn on this other version of myself that was all about caring relationships. And I think that took a larger toll than I realized at the time, and I wish that on no one.
Yeah, work with people who challenge you, but care for you. And good people, work with good people. From an academic perspective, I think there's a lot of value if you can handle it, like putting yourself in positions that you're not ready for. Because it's like any growth, you're not ready for it until it actually happens. And I've certainly found that some of the most impactful academic experiences have also been the most uncomfortable. Right? And that's not me, that's bell hooks, that's teaching to transgress, you know? But I've certainly found that to be very formative. And yeah, like the capacity for collective action is not in research per se, it's not in social institutions, it's not in policy, but as Dorothy Smith reminds us, it's among people.
Mm-hmm. So that's it for us. But if anyone else is feeling like, do you want to ask a question, or should we call it? Because it's 4:30.
Oh, wow.
It's been a long
Really
day.
good.
Yeah.
Really good. Woo! All right.
Thank you, everyone. Colin, do you have words for us, like logistically?
Yeah, you thought you were getting off easy. No, now it's my turn to talk for an hour. No, I just want to say thank you so much, everybody. Today was very successful. I'm really, really happy with the way things are going. And there is going to be a little cash bar service, so please stick around. Tomorrow we get started again at 9:30. So show up for 9 o'clock. You get first dibs on coffee. If you have any questions before, during, or after, just get in touch with me. Shoot me an email. And thank you again. And we will see you around. Enjoy, everybody.
I need to go get my.
Jane would have been the middle, right? Jane
Oh my
would have been the
God,
middle and just like
totally.
connecting dots.
Yeah.
And like, well, what I'm
And
hearing
also
here,
calling
you know?
us out.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially me.
Well,
They
I had
always
a whole
call me
like
out.
I had a whole like anarchist prefigurative politics section for Jane, and then anyways.